Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we're going to be going over and showing you how to install the Firestone Ride-Rite red label air helper springs here on a 2020 GMC Sierra 3500. So you may be asking yourself, what are air helper springs and why do you want them? Because if you've talked to your buddies about towing, chances are these have come up. And the reason for this is they're actually one of the most popular suspension enhancement options on the market, and for good reason. So if you find yourself to be towing a trailer frequently or just simply hauling heavy loads, you've probably experienced rear end squat / sag. So this not only looks a little funky, but this rear end sag can actually have drastic effects on your vehicle. It can be something as minor as just the improper headlight aim, but all the way up to something as serious as improper braking or increased tire wear. So that's where these air helper springs are really going to come into play. They're going to reduce the level of sag / squat we have while we're towing or hauling. Now, they're certainly not the only option on the market as far as suspension enhancement goes. There's plenty of other ones, but if you ask me, airbags are truly best because we can fine-tune the adjustment to the rear end suspension here. So in order to reduce the sag and squat, we have to increase the stiffness. But the adverse effect of increasing the stiffness is that we're going to be making the ride more uncomfortable. So with airbags, we can fine-tune that adjustment, so we're really getting the best possible mix between support and comfort. So let's compare that to some of the other more popular suspension enhancements on the market. You're probably familiar with Timbren springs. That's actually a replacement jout spring. It's going to be a little bit taller than your factory jout spring, so it's going to engage sooner, and it's also much harder, so it's going to provide more support. Now, the sort of downside of Timbrens are they're not going to engage until you already get a few inches of squat, and if you've talked to people who've used them, they can be kind of rough on the ride quality. Now, another popular option on the market is the Roadmaster Active Suspension, abbreviated as RAS, and that's kind of like a spring that you add to your leaf springs, and it's sort of like a coil spring that installs on the leaf spring. So these are a great option. They're similar to airbags in that you can adjust them. However, the adjustment process for those isn't anywhere near as easy as it is for airbags. You actually have to have tools for that, and they actually do recommend taking off the tire. So you really can't get any better options than airbags. If I had a truck here that I was towing frequently with, they are 100% hands down the choice I'm going to make. So speaking more about airbags specifically, there's actually two different options for your vehicle. You have both airlift options and you have Firestone. Now, the bag design of the Firestone ones is a little bit more durable, so that's what I recommend. But there's also two more options within the Firestone brand. You have the standard version, which is rated at 5,000 pounds, and you have the red label version, which is what we're going to be installing, rated at 7,500 pounds. Now, the red label version is going to be more for those heavy duty haulers, people who are towing more frequently, because it does have a little bit more capacity there and more range of adjustability, up to 150 PSI. So this kit does come with everything you need to get set up and going, but there is one thing you might want to add, and that's going to be an onboard air compressor. Now, the reason you might want to add an onboard air compressor is if you frequently change your loads, because adding that onboard air compressor allows you to adjust the pressure in the airbags with a flip of the switch inside the cab of the vehicle. Normally, you would have to have access to an external air compressor, which is fine if you just have one trailer that you tow once or twice a month. But if you find yourself to be towing frequently, several times a week, you're definitely going to want to look into that air compressor system. And we're actually installing one on this vehicle, a wireless one, if you'd like to check that out. So we've told you why airbags are important. Now we're going to show you. And as a visual for this, we're going to be measuring the amount of lift we get in the front end and the amount of sag we get in the rear end when we place a load in the truck bed. But first, we're going to go ahead and measure the factory suspension unloaded. So we're going to measure from the ground to the bottom edge of the wheel well at the center there, and we're right at 40 inches here in the front. Now we'll come back to the rear here, take that same measurement. And for this, you're looking at right at 42 inches. So there is a 2-inch rake on this vehicle from the factory. So now we're going to go ahead and throw some weight in our truck bed here so we can see how much she squats. Now, we're going to be throwing anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 pounds in here, but just keep in mind, these measurements are just sort of a baseline visual. Your exact measurements are probably going to vary a little bit depending on tire size and your exact load. So just use these as a point of reference. So now we'll retake our measurements here, and if you remember before in the front we were at 40 inches, so let's see if that changed. So we're looking at about 40.5 inches. So it looks like we went up about a half inch. And then same measurement at the rear here. Before we were at 42 inches. Now we're looking at about 40 inches. So it almost dropped a full 2 inches in the rear. And this is a relatively light load because this is a heavy duty truck. So again, your measurements may vary a little bit, but even with about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, we're definitely still squatting a little bit, kicking that front end up, which is going to cause all sorts of issues. So now let's go ahead and head out to our test course here so we can see how she really performs with some evasive maneuvering and speed bumps. So we took a couple laps around our parking lot here in the test courses, and overall, it wasn't terrible, but I could definitely feel a lack of responsiveness in our steering wheel, and especially when we were going through that slalom course there was a lot of body roll on the truck back and forth from that weight sort of jumping around. So here's what our airbags look like when they're installed in the vehicle, and if we hold up the factory joust spring that they replaced, you can see there's quite a substantial difference in size. So the airbags are going to engage much sooner than these joust springs, and they're also going to offer more support. So these airbags here, these have a double bellow design, a nice thick durable rubber, and something that Firestone does with their airbags, they have a crimp roll design, which is how they attach these metal plates to the rubber air spring, and it is a much more durable hold than some of the other similar options that use more like of a band clamp. So the overall construction of the airbag is going to be much more durable. You can actually let the axle hang freely with these installed without damaging them. Those other band clamp design airbags, you cannot do that. So overall, these Firestones are going to be much more durable. So now that we have our airbags installed, we have our weight back in the truck bed here, we'll go ahead and retake our measurements. So at the front, if you remember, we were at 40 inches and we're pretty much at that now. And in the rear, we were at 42 inches. And we're pretty much back there as well. So we have the factory rake now on the truck with our airbags installed. So we just got done driving with our airbags installed, and I could definitely tell an improvement. Now granted, we just took a few short laps around our parking lot, but I definitely didn't have to put near as much input into the steering wheel. It felt a lot more responsive, and the body roll was certainly reduced as well. So we're ready to start our installation now, and just a few little pointers here. So you can do this installation with the truck on the ground, resting in its own weight there, just on the tires. You don't have to jack it up or anything. But if you do that, you're probably going to want a way to sort of lift the rear of the truck up a little bit, which is going to separate the distance between the frame and the axle, just to give you a little bit more room to work. Or you could obviously just place the truck on jack stands and let the axle hang freely. So choice is up to you, but we're just using a jack stand here on the bottom of our trailer hitch here, just to separate that frame and the axle a little bit to give us more room to work. So once we've done that, we've prepared our truck here. We're going to go ahead and take a couple tools. We're going to take a pry tool. You can use a large pry tool like this, or just a long flathead screwdriver will work as well. And we're also going to take some spray lubricants, because what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be prying out the factory joust springs. So I'm going to take this spray lubricant. I'm just going to spray it around where the cup and the joust spring meet, just to help work that oil in there, make it a little bit easier to get out. Now I'm going to take my pry tool here. Now I've gotten these out a couple different ways. Sometimes I kind of just shove it up in there, sort of rotate it like that. Sometimes you can get it out doing that. Other times you actually have to pry down a little bit more. These things are kind of stuck in here, so they are kind of hard to remove, but basically we're just going to be prying between the metal and that foam spring there so we can separate the two. Now we're going to gather everything that we see here, because we're going to be doing some assembly outside the vehicle. So we're going to grab our upper bracket, our spring clamps, we have some 3/8 Allen head bolts here, and then we have some 1/4 inch hex bolts. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these spring clamps. So the large hole is going to go to the bottom oblong hole there, just like so. Place one there, and then we're going to loosely secure these. So these ones are probably going to fall on me, but from underneath there's going to be a bevel in the bottom of the bracket that the Allen head bolts are going to sit into nicely. So you're going to hold it there, place one end over there, And then again, we'll loosely, don't tighten it down yet, loosely secure our flange nut. So I'm going to do that for each of our 4 corners here. And then once we get this partially assembled, we're actually going to be placing it on the vehicle. So if you remember the jout spring that we removed earlier, this is pretty much just going to go in between there, and then this part is going to sit upside the frame. But we're going to do that. We want to make sure that we grab these 1/4 inch hex bolts and our flange nuts as well. So now we'll take our assembly here, we'll go ahead and set it up into position. So basically we want the bottom of the spring cup to be flush to the top of our upper bracket. So it's going to fit into position just like that. So now this part is kind of difficult because you kind of need 3 hands to do everything, but I'm going to use 1 hand to apply upward pressure from the upper bracket to the bottom of the spring cup. And then here's where I'm going to come back with those 1/4 inch hex bolts. We're going to be securing them to these holes here. So I'll go ahead and get this one started. We'll leave that loose, and then I'll jump onto the other side and I'll get that one started. So once I get those both started, I'm going to hold off on tightening them down. The bracket should hold itself in place because we're going to start tightening down these 1/4 inch hex bolts, but we need to make sure we tighten them down evenly. So you want to alternate side to side. So in order to tighten these down, you're going to need a 3/8 inch wrench and then a 7/16 inch socket. So again, this is kind of the 3 hands technique because we have to hold everything in place while we tighten this down. So I'm going to get everything started here, and then I'm going to use one of my hands to apply upward pressure because it's very important that these 2 plates are flush to one another. So again, we need to alternate, so I'm going to jump over to the other side and begin tightening down over there. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to feel up atop of that plate there and underneath the jout spring cup. That side is flush, but if I reach back here, I see an actual gap is formed. So I need to go ahead and loosen this up, push it up into place, and then I can draw it back down a little more. Yeah, you can see that plate has some play in there. So we need to make sure that we're putting upward pressure when we're tightening that down. Next, I'll take a 7/32 inch Allen key and I'm going to tighten and torque each of those 4 bolts. Now it's a good time to check again to make sure that plate is flush because these bolts here will draw that up a little bit if it's not already. So next we're going to come back to our table / workbench here. We're going to do some more assembly outside the vehicle. So for this step you're going to grab your air spring, your lower bracket that looks like this, and then a 3/8 Allen head bolt. So this one is black and it's a little bit smaller than the ones we were working with. There should only be 2 in your kit. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip the air spring over to the bottom. That's our attachment hole. It's going to line up with this hole in the bracket here. You want the beveled edge facing down, and then we'll just loosely secure this for now. So it doesn't matter which air spring you grab or which lower bracket. Same goes with the upper brackets. Everything is the same for this kit. Next, I'm going to compress this down and then reinstall the plug. So this is going to make it a little bit easier to get into position. So now I'm going to place the lower air spring assembly into position. So this flat part here with the ridge is going to go towards the leaf spring pack. And it should just pop right into position like so. I'm going to take out my plug there, let the airbag expand, line up your inflation port here with the hole in the upper bracket, and then it should sort of just go into position. It's going to sit where it wants to. So an important note here, we're going to pull the air spring assembly back down just briefly so we can show you something. So in the top of your upper bracket, you're going to have 3 holes. These are going to be your alignment pin holes. And then on the top of the air spring, you're going to have a little stud here, which is your alignment pin. We need to be sure that this alignment pin is going to be seated within that center hole there. So it is kind of hard to see that while you're putting it into position, but it is pretty critical to make sure that alignment pin lines up with this center hole. So now once we're certain that we have the alignment pin in the center hole, I'm going to take a paint marker here I'm just going to mark on this airbag bracket here, or on the airbag, and then on the bracket. So this is going to be sort of our alignment mark. So when we take the airbag and the lower bracket off the vehicle to tighten that lower bolt, we can hold it steady on those two lines there. That way when we put it back into position, our alignment pin is going to match up with the center hole. So now once we're certain that our alignment pin is in the center hole, you can see here I just took a paint marker and I marked the air spring and the lower bracket, because we're actually going to be removing the air spring and lower bracket from the vehicle so we can tighten down that lower bolt there. And then when we set it back up into the vehicle, this is going to allow our alignment pin to match up with that center hole there without having to worry about fighting it and adjusting it again. So I've got our mark made here. I'm just going to go ahead and pull the air spring. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall that plug as well. And I'll just pull this up and off the vehicle. So now I'm going to keep a close eye on those alignment marks. I'm going to go ahead and tighten down this Allen key. You can sort of adjust it a little bit more, but you want to make sure it's dead on when we come to torquing it down. And again, we're just using that same 7/32 Allen key that we've been using so far. So it can be a little tricky to tighten this down because you kind of have to do it on a table. But really we just want to make sure that that alignment pin or the alignment marks there don't move on us. See, it's starting to rotate on me a little bit now, so I'm going to have to do a better job of holding it there. There we go. And if we look, our alignment marks are still dead on. So now we'll go ahead and pop this back on the vehicle. So to secure our air spring to our upper bracket, we're going to be using our internal tooth washer. You're going to place that over the stud, and then you're going to follow this up with your very large hex nut. We're just going to begin threading that on by hand as tight as we can get it. Next, we're going to tighten down that hex nut. Now it is a very large hex nut, therefore it's going to require a very large wrench. It's actually going to require a 1 1/8 wrench. Now if you don't have one of those, that's totally fine. You might be able to fit a crescent wrench up in there. Thankfully, this particular nut here is not going to be bearing a load or anything, so you don't have to worry about torque specs. We just want to get it nice and snug. We'll now take our air fitting, which screws into the airbag. It's going to screw into the center of that post we were just working with. And we're going to do this using a 15mm wrench. Now keep in mind, you don't need to tighten this thing all the way down. We just want to get a few threads in there with that locker on there, so it's going to seal it nice and good. But again, you don't want to over torque this. So I'm just going to get it started by hand, and I'll switch over to my wrench here, and I'll give her a few turns or so to tighten it up. Next, we're going to take your spring hook, looks like this, and this is actually going to go behind the brake line, and this part here is going to hook onto the spring perch. And once we get it in there, it's going to align with that square hole in the bottom of our lower bracket. Then we'll just come back with our carriage bolt here. It's going to be the longer carriage bolt. I believe they're the only carriage bolts that are actually in your kit. And then we're going to screw on our flange nut. I'll go ahead and tighten that as much as I can by hand. So we've got one on the front side and we also have one on the back side. So this one on the back side is a little bit trickier because there's not enough clearance between the axle tube and our spring perch for that hook to really seat properly, and we also have the welded on shock mount. So this one is certainly not ideal. I always fight with these when I do these rear ones here on these Chevy trucks. But you can get it on there as best you can. It's usually not going to be totally straight, but that's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. And I'm going to thread on that nut. So I'm going to switch over to a 14mm wrench here, and I'm going to tighten these up. Now there is a torque spec for these bolts here, but let's face it here, you're not going to be able to get a torque wrench here due to that brake line on this front one. We might be able to torque the back one down, but just tighten it as best you can. It's not a ton of torque anyways. So now that we have this side buttoned up, we're just going to repeat that exact same process over on the passenger side. There is, however, one small difference. So So on the passenger side, you need to make sure you use the included heat shield between the air spring and the upper mount there to shield from the exhaust, which is very close to the airbag. So now we're going to mount our inflation valve bracket. So this is what it looks like, comes in your kit, has these two very large zip ties. So we're going to secure this to the bottom of the cross tube for our trailer hitch. Now the welding here does sort of limit how far over we can go, so we do have to sort of pin it to the inside of the bumper there. And one of these zip ties is going to be a little crooked, but this is still the best location. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick one end of the zip tie through our bracket there. And it's a little tricky, but we're going to reach that other end around the cross tube of the hitch and then secure it. So I'm going to get that one started there. I'm going to come back and install my other one as well. So I went ahead and just rotated the zip ties so that fat knobby part is at the back there, not the front. But now I'm just going to pull them tight. Get them as tight as you can by hand. And then we're going to go ahead and trim the rest off. Now we're going to secure our inflation ports to the bracket we just installed. So we're going to take our inflation port. You're going to take a flat washer, place it over the threaded end like so. And then we're actually going to come from the back side of the bracket like there. Let that sit there for a second. I'm going to place another flat washer over there. And then there should be a jam nut already threaded onto the inflation valve. So we'll just take that off and then re-secure it like so. And that's pretty much it. We'll get out our wrenches here so we can tighten those down. We're going to have one on each side. Now what we can do is we can have a dual pass system, meaning we install two valves, one to each of our airbags, or you can purchase a T and have both airbags fill up with one valve. It's totally up to you. I would say the majority of towing applications really only require a single pass system with one valve, but it does allow you to hook it up so there's two. So we're going to use a 1/2 inch socket and a 1/2 inch wrench in order to tighten down these inflation valves. You don't want them super tight, just snug them up so they don't swivel in the bracket here. So next we're going to take the airline that comes in your kit and we're going to route it from the inflation valve that we just mounted on the vehicle to the air fitting on the airbag. So we want to be careful when we're over here on the passenger side because we do have the exhaust. So in your kit here, you're going to get these little heat tubes that you're going to place over the airline just at the first couple feet or so where it's closest to the exhaust. You're also going to get some zip ties in your kit because you want to make sure you secure that airline up on the frame of the vehicle or to some existing wiring so it doesn't fall down. Now I also want to point out that when you're cutting the airline, because you will need to cut it to fit your exact application, you want to make sure you make nice and straight cuts with a razor blade as best you can. Don't use any sort of diagonal cutters or even scissors. You want to make sure you get a nice sharp clean cut with the razor. So those push to connect fittings, you basically just push them all the way down and then you pull it up to lock it in place. So that's going to be the case for both the air fitting on top of the airbag and the inflation valve that we mounted on the rear of the vehicle. So I want to make a note that you need to make sure you give yourselves a little bit of extra slack because the vehicle will be raising and lowering depending on the how much pressure we put in those airbags. So you can see up here we gave ourselves a little bit of extra slack to allow the suspension to articulate freely, and we also want to make sure that we have enough line if we need to make any repair. So make sure you don't cut it too short. So now we're going to fill each of our airbags up to around 50 psi to test. So we're going to let that pressure sit in there for a second, then we're going to spray all of our fittings and our lines down with a solution of soap and water because that's going to allow us to check for leaks. If we do have any leaks, you're going to see some rapid forming bubbles. Usually those leaks occur at the fittings into the airbag or where the line actually goes into the fittings, whether that be the airbag fitting or the inflation valve fitting. So those are the more common places you're going to be checking. If you do have any leaks, remove the airline tubing, recut it, or tighten the fitting down a little bit more. So with no leaks detected, that's going to do it today for our look and installation of the Firestone Ride-Rite Red Label Air Helper Springs here on our 2020 GMC Sierra 3500.